Today I'm going to be talking about the return to Mars and basically just how it fits into the overall ancient astronaut question. There's been a lot of new information coming out in the last few weeks around the government's involvement of the cover-up and UFOs in general. So I think this will hopefully provide context to people who are new to these topics and just see how far back these really extend into our past. Now, one thing that's really interesting is that the whole idea of us going to Mars, it's not really a new topic. In fact, most likely we've already been to Mars in secret classified missions, even from other countries. This is a video that's kind of entertaining. It was released in 1977 out of the UK, and it actually shows a color footage of a landing on Mars by a Russian crew. Now, while it's fake, but it is demonstrating the possibilities that we landed on Mars probably back in the 60s. And the fact that they've identified life and other forms of life on Mars is probably a normal, understood fact. But since we don't have any of those facts, I wanted to share this video with you because I thought it was kind of an entertaining look at what might have happened.
Okay, and mode 1 scanning. Stand by and move on. Standing by. Roger, standing by. Hey, isn't that an old riverbed? Can you verify that, Curatam? Roger, Houston, we saw that. Stand by for readings, Houston. Standing by, Curatam.
This is where we would land anyways today, is in the Gusev crater, which is an ancient waterbed, an ancient salt water bed of probably an ocean that was on Mars.
Southwest. Score is 20 kilometers chance. Atmosphere pressure 707.7 millibars. Atmosphere давление 77 millibars. It's good. It's good, Curatam. On the nose. Stand by for landing, Curatam. Stand by.
Not the best special effects for bad transmission, but pay attention carefully as they land.
This thing is going to be the biggest date in history. 22nd May, 1962. We're on the planet Mars, and we have life.
1962, folks. So theoretical movie just proposing the idea that we already went to Mars, and I pretty much already support that idea based on the data that we've seen. It's just been covered up to the public. This was a very interesting video that you can't find anywhere. It's not on any digital platform that you can rent or buy, but it showed a very interesting scenario of scientists pretty much being taken off planet in like a huge cover-up, where people were basically being removed from the planet to create a new civilization on Mars. So it is one of those alternatives that talks about how we will greatly reduce the populations on Earth through natural disasters and various other things. So I thought it was kind of a timely video, kind of appropriate to show where we might have already have gone with Mars. Now, other interesting pieces about Mars is that, you know, the fact that there's possibly life on Mars is a well-known norm. In the 70s, some of the missions that we sent showed that there's possible signs of life on Mars, but they just didn't have the equipment yet to detect it. We have actually found meteorites that have struck Antarctica, fragments of Mars, something probably hit Mars in the past, blew off debris, and some of that debris landed on Earth. And one of those fragments actually contained fossilized microbes within the material. So, you know, it's very possible that what we're seeing here are just basic life fragments from Mars, and that once we land on Mars, it'll become a prevalent norm that life exists all over the planet. Now, recently we just sent a new mission to Mars, and they landed successfully. I say recent because you can tell everyone's wearing face masks. So what's interesting about this latest Perseverance is that it also has the ability to start looking for signs of life, to actually stick tools in the dirt, pull out those samples and send them back to Earth. This is a new type of mission that we've never been able to do before, is actually take samples back to Earth. And also the ability to just look for samples and go across the terrain of Mars in a new way. So you can see this is the rover and all the equipment that it has. various instrumentation. The one with the, labeled in the front with a red object is something that actually sticks in the dirt and looks for amino acids and various other signs of life. This is really interesting too, because a lot of people thought there was a cover-up at NASA for so many years, which there is. But, there's a lot of engineers that are just doing their job. There's some guy that's been working there for 16 years, building a little device that's going to stick into the dirt and look for amino acids and signs of life. All of our previous rovers didn't have those types of instrumentation. So it's not like they couldn't tell us there was life or show signs of life. We literally didn't have the tools to even detect it, which again is kind of odd. But now we do. And so this latest mission is actually looking for signs of life, and we'll be able to return samples, amazingly, back to Earth at a future mission so that those can be analyzed and actually look at rock fragments and pieces of the material from Mars itself. Now, along with that, we're going to be launching this little helicopter that is pretty much like a drone for the probe. It's a very stable helicopter, solar powered, but it's going to allow us to start to see the surface of Mars in new ways and charge Perseverance using a solar cell that can be moved around based on if there's a dust storm or something. These things are made of carbon fiber or super, super strong. They could crash from 1,000 feet and still be fine. But yeah, we have this technology now that's going to allow us to start to explore the surface in a much more dense way, and using these technologies to coordinate between the rover and the drone. So, I just think it's interesting that we're starting to arm ourselves with much better technology so that as we eventually get to Mars, we're going to be able to really decipher much more than we could by just, having tools alone. Us there present working with these tools is really going to change the game. So one of the pioneers kind of leading this mission is SpaceX, Elon Musk's company. And what's really interesting about SpaceX is the trajectory and timeline of returning to Mars. They've literally already completed tests of their spaceship, doing landing on vertical landings and vertical takeoffs successfully. They've actually taken the crew on this craft already to the space station successfully. So what they're doing is targeting a certain area within a crater here, you can see, and they're going to actually be looking for the best place to land and set up a base camp. Now, in the past, talking about taking people to Mars, there's always been more or less a political backup. NASA just wasn't ready with the resources and the technology to actually take a manned mission to Mars. This raises the big question as to why we haven't even returned to the moon. There could be deeper questions there, but you can see from all these surface images of Perseverance, they're looking at this ancient riverbed and analyzing where it's going to be for the best place to land. Now, this raises a bigger question really as to what they're trying to answer is, where do we really come from? Finally, the scientific community, NASA and other space companies, SpaceX and what have you, are leading the mission to answer this question of where do we come from, sending a manned mission to Mars permanently. Within 5 years, we're going to actually be on Mars again, folks. Within 10 years, we'll be on the moon and Mars, transferring resources between the two. So, this is kind of a deeper question around what we're going to do. And if you look back to trying to understand where does life come from, the best answer that we have yet so far is life arrives from space. The best example of this is Panspermia. Life arrived to Earth whole and complete. There wasn't this natural evolution that took place on Earth for billions of years for life to start. It arrived here whole and complete. There's too much of a process for it to have even taken place on the time span that Earth has to offer. So, the whole idea that when we're looking for signs of life, not only here on Earth, but also on Mars, well, we can start to gut check ourselves for what we can find for those signs of life being found on Mars. Probably the same artifacts of what kickstarted life here on Earth. Life arose whole and complete. Something either is sending life as a natural process, like seeds going out and they plant themselves, or it's a directed purpose, like directed panspermia. Someone is intentionally sending life to certain worlds that are capable of being able to host and further explore possibilities. So it's very possible that's what's going on here on Earth, is that we've identified how life arose, where the parameters life needs to sustain and grow. And it turns out that life on Earth is probably not the only parameters needed. Across the solar system, we're starting to realize that there are planets that can harbor life in very unique places. For instance, some of the moons of Jupiter, Ganymede, Callisto, huge volcanoes. Then you have other ones like Europa, which are covered with water and ice, probably a 40-mile deep ocean surrounding the whole planet. So if you take the factors of what we have on Earth, heat, thermal vents, you can go down to the bottom of the ocean, no sunlight whatsoever, but these thermal vents generating heat and giving off nutrients, life is thriving. So it's very possible that there are other places within our solar system, just like Europa, where if we can breach these ice sheets and dive to the bottom of Europa, more than likely thermal vents and other areas there will be harboring life. So throughout the solar system, we have opportunities to start to look for life, the signs of life. Mars is going to be that first step where we can answer those questions firsthand by sending people there. Now, as I mentioned, there are current missions scheduled to take humans to Mars in 2025, 2027, the latest. And once we're on the surface of Mars, actually looking at some of those artifacts, Cydonia, the face, the pyramids, and being hands-on, who knows what we might really find, which will actually push the envelope of our human history much further. So I'm very excited to watch what takes place with, the whole launch trajectory of how they're going to be sending materials from Earth in these several stage rockets that will then land on Mars in a vertical landing and be reusable between Mars and Earth, sending back and receiving materials and personnel. So this is going to be some really interesting times, folks. It's happening within our lifetime. Within the next 5 years, we're returning to Mars with people. Now, that's a big statement because the whole idea of a cover-up, the whole idea that you can't show us what's been going on in space, that literally since COVID-19 has stopped. The blanket of what's going on in space is going to be lifted. Maybe COVID-19 happened because they were preparing to let us into space and having to face that fact. Within the next 4 to 5 years, we are returning to space as a civilization. So being able to see what's going on in space and not be able to hide that is another interesting question. So I'm very anxious for us to return to Mars as a civilization in our lifetime, because this really will change the game for us being a species, not dependent on just Earth, but also realizing the origins of where we really come from, finding artifacts across other planets that show signs of intelligence, that we've already been there. Mars is clearly one of those. As you're going to see, the data I'm going to show you is not made up. This is all from NASA images. You wonder why it's not on MSNBC being publicized, but it is within all of the NASA archives, and going through and showing you all this information, I think is a prerequisite for understanding why we're actually going there. There are some very large questions for us to ask, and Mars holds the answers. Now, eventually, you're going to see a digital footprint on Mars, similar to what we have on Earth. Once we can set up a technological base and have, various things that we need, very quickly, Mars will become another sustainable colony where we'll be able to send personnel, supplies, and pretty much have a dual thing happening between Mars and Earth. And this is all going to happen within our lifetime, folks. Now, returning to Mars, returning to the moon, we're going to be doing it differently this time as to some of the initial missions, because now we're going to have the ability to reuse natural resources on the surface for creating dwellings, for using natural resources for gas and water, and just other things that we needed to survive. Most of those can all be found already on the surface of Mars and the surface of the moon. So it's just a matter of using the natural resources, the materials available on those planets for us to build new sustainable living environments. So, this is work 20 years in the planning as to what they're going to do, what type of materials, what types of bases that they'll set up. And most of these are very lightweight, flimsy materials. Literally the distance between you and space is like you could punch a hole, through it. So it's still very flimsy, and they have to be very careful. But over the years, they're going to be able to start to fortify and create actual structures. Most of these initial ones will be made from mylar and rubber and very thin materials that can be easily transported from Earth to Mars. But as you'll see, folks, there's going to be a new change where, just like in the old days of, Uncle Sam saying, we need you to sign up to the military. Well, they're going to need you to sign up for space. If you think about this, folks, as we return to being a global community in space, that means that we're going to have a whole bunch of new jobs, companies working in space, just the basic necessities of what you need for keeping people occupied, feeding them, housing them, transporting them. This is all going to be happening within the next few years, and it's going to create a whole new job industry of jobs available to civilians in space. I'd encourage you to start to look towards companies like Tesla, SpaceX, Virgin Galactic, and others, where you'll see that there are going to be opportunities to become an employee of that company and not only benefit from the interesting things that'll be happening, but also the financial aspects as we explore a new territory in space. Now, some of the original reasons why Mars became such a fascination to us is that we literally thought it was another planet that harbored life. Some of the original observations of Giovanni Schiaparelli, using very modest telescopes, kind of looking through, he saw what he identified as canali. He thought that all over the surface of Mars, he was able to identify interconnecting waterways, which showed that, in fact, Mars in the past was flowing with water, just an abundance of waterways all over the surface of the planet. And that obviously changes the perspective of what we see now as this barren planet, dark, red, barren of atmosphere. That most likely has not been the case throughout time. In the past, thousands of years ago, Mars was flourishing with life, flourishing with living systems, plants, water. And so that's what we see across the surface is ancient evidence that Mars was a living planet in the past. So to further that, we've sent a bunch of technology over the last 2 decades to analyze the makeup of Mars, the surface topography of Mars, what's currently in the surface of Mars as far as elements at the poles, the frozen ice. Is that just frozen water? What is it actually made up of? So we've been collecting a lot of data over the last 20 years, analyzing the best spots where it would make sense to perhaps land a future colony on Mars, have the right resources naturally to begin setting up and have a new civilization. So, these initial steps that we take with our tools, sending probes and rovers, they've really been laying the groundwork for us to kind of have our eyes and ears on the surface and start to understand what we're looking at. Over the years, as I've mentioned, the probes we've sent in the past, there's been several different probes and none of them really had the technology like this latest one had. Pathfinder in 1997 was initially armed with the ability to just roll around and look at stuff. Now, a lot of these rovers are still on the surface of Mars. A lot of them are still active. Some of them might have been taken offline because of dust storms and their solar cells are just not working, or it's a cover-up and they're being repurposed and used for other missions that are no longer for the public's concern. But this latest one, Perseverance, does have an abundance of technology to poke right into the ground and look for signs of life and literally collect those materials and such and send those samples back to Earth in the near future. So I'm very encouraged. Also, the size of this drone, it's huge. It's like the size of a Volkswagen Bug versus the other ones they've sent in the past that were smaller. So I don't know. It's very interesting to see what we're doing with Mars. And I think it's important for all of us to have an awareness of what's going on so it doesn't just fall in your lap one day and realize that, we're back on Mars. Now, when I say back on Mars, folks, I keep saying this, return to Mars, go back to Mars. We've been there a long time. And it turns out that the way we position Mars as this dark, dead planet, it's not true. It's just not the case. Look at these images from 1979, Viking, when we landed the first orbiters on the surface of Mars. What do we find? Snow, liquid frozen water all over the surface of Mars. Is there water other places than Earth? Yeah, here it is. Why don't they, highlight this or make it a big deal? Another thing to point out is that if you look at the image here on one side of the screen, it's a darker, redder tint, more of what you'd see on Mars. But the cameras that we put on those landers are taking a much larger spectrum of light into the red spectrum because they can see much more dense, artifacts and things using a broader spectrum of light than just RGB of what the human eye can see. When you normalize these images for what the human eye would see, they don't have this red tint. In fact, most of the images look more like this, like the actual surface of a planet, and not like this dark red dense planet that you see from an uncolor corrected camera image. Now, sometimes during the press conferences, they would color correct and you'd get these shots like you see here. But there's enough evidence to show us, folks, that the surface of Mars, if you're standing on it, looks pretty much like the surface of Earth. Now, the atmosphere is not as dense, but as we'll further test and see, the atmosphere on Mars is probably strong enough in certain areas for you to stand on the surface and breathe. I don't know why they're not telling us this, but there's clearly enough evidence to show that the methane being collected in the atmosphere shows that plants, probably even animals of some kind, are causing an eroding of their elements, and that methane gas released in the atmosphere shows that there is some type of biological process happening on Mars today. So, a lot of this really wasn't on our radar until ESA, the European Space Agency, started to take color images of the same areas that NASA films in black and white. And a lot of these images that NASA films in black and white, again, folks, what I'm going to show you is in all of the archives. What it shows is clear water being collected on the surface of Mars, plants, chlorophyll of some kind living and thriving all around these collections of water, all over the surface of Mars. NASA doesn't release any of this. NASA doesn't photograph any of this in color and release it to the public, but ESA did. And so some of the areas that NASA films, we look at this and we say, well, this swath, and what I say is a swath, if you look closely on my screen, you'll see that the image you're looking at is actually multiple strips compiled together to make one larger image. So what NASA is able to do is fly over these areas and take very high resolution swaths and then stitch those together to see a very clear image. And they did this over the Gusev crater and various other spots. But what do we see? We see something that looks interesting. It almost looks like what could be grass or some type of like trees or something coming out of the surface, but it's in black and white. It's very hard to discern what we're looking at. Now, ESA filmed that same area, same coordinates in color, and look what we see, right? It's vegetation on Mars, folks. Now, why NASA isn't showing this to us or why they're withholding the evidence raises a lot of questions as to their honesty. If there's plants growing on Mars, you'd think that that would be a pretty big deal. So for whatever reason, they're hiding this information. The other space agencies, European Space Agency, the Chinese Space Agency, they're all going to not probably be operating under the same blanket of secrecy as NASA. Maybe they are. I guess we'll just have to see, but we can see that there are gaps in how the data is passed between these organizations, and that Chinese, European, they might not have the same standards as NASA. Now, a lot of clues have been released over the years as NASA has been exploring Mars to show that Mars is actually a watery planet, that in its past it was covered by water, and that most of the areas that they've been landing in are ancient seabeds. In 2004, you can see that on the graphic up there, M2K4, they released this data that there's lots of signs that there are salty seas that used to exist on Mars. Salty oceans, very similar to what we have on Earth, prominent for having life. Now, what's really interesting here, though, is kind of being a NASA watchdog. Again, this article came out in 2004. Now, here we have a movie that was just released, in 2017, okay? And it's called The Martian, starring Matt Damon. And Matt Damon and the director Ridley Scott partner with NASA to do this amazing press release as to why the Martian movie is so timely, because They found water on Mars. It's amazing. Well, so what? It's literally a stunt to make the movie more popular. The fact that they released this data 10 years ago in 2004, not 2017, really raises the question as to how NASA aligns to its priorities. With just a Hollywood film, they take their data, re-scramble it, and say, yes, new releases, when in fact it's just recycled information. So I think what I'd like to dive into now is just kind of showing you some of this data, some of this evidence that you'll see is quite striking. Here is an image of the surface of Mars where there's some collection of water on the surface, and you can see that there's even like density where it's probably not as dense or as deep in some areas, and then it gets very deep in some of these channels. And this is literally liquid water standing on the surface of Mars, lakes on the surface of Mars. These are standing areas on Mars, imaged by the Mars Global Surveyor, that show standing water on Mars. And you can see all around this body of water look to be some type of chlorophyll or plant-based organisms that are living in the area. And these are all over Mars, folks. All of these little collection patches are covered with these chlorophyll. Now, again, NASA's releasing this in black and white. I bet you if we looked at this in color, you'd see a lot of green chlorophyll, clearly denoting that these are living plants on the surface of Mars. When we compare this to other areas like Earth, that shot you see labeled Earth, those are the Great Lakes. Those are the Great Lakes on Earth. Now, those same shots on Earth, those same shots on Mars, again, you can see even the tint of these photos almost have a dark green to them, even though they're not done in full color. But that's clearly a body of water surrounded by dense plant materials all around the rim and feathering out, just like we see here on Earth. So this really raises a lot of questions about what we're seeing on Mars, because clearly if these are bodies of water that you could probably just go and like take a swim in a lake on Mars, why is this not being told publicly? Is it because there's some type of a timeline release for when we're supposed to be interested in going back to Mars, not paying attention too closely about what's going on Mars? I don't know. But over the years, the data that we have from Cydonia, the face, and the pyramids, as you'll see, has really raised a lot of flags and encouraged us to do exactly what you're doing, is look at other areas and look for signs of life. And in doing that, what do we find? All over the planet, there are signs of not only liquid water, but like signals that there could be ancient cities or other structures currently still buried under the sands of Mars. Some of these structures here show what very, very simply resemble Aztec structures or other structures that we have seen across parts of the Earth. Here, if we look at, Pumapunku or some of these other sites in a satellite view and compare them to what we're seeing on Mars, there are similarities that make you wonder if there aren't other ancient cities across the surface of Mars that we have yet to discover. A lot of these ruins on Earth are blueprints for what we can also look for signs on Mars. And it turns out that evidence does exist. There are images across the surface of Mars which do show what appear to be ancient cities. Now, again, these could just be natural terrain, but the non-random placement of these objects across several areas on Mars, it just starts to raise the questions. This is probably natural terrain. I would side more to that. But what I would say is that it merits us to further look into these questions. Now, as you'll see, there is definitely a connection between Mars and Earth. Something has been happening for quite some time that makes us need to try and answer these questions about just where do we really come from. And so for quite some time, the data that we've been getting back from Mars shows us that there is something on the structure of Mars. Here we can see that in Cydonia region, they label what we show as structures that are a pyramid, one that's labeled the fort, and then you can see I have something labeled as headdress because that clearly looks like a face of some kind. But even more than that, you can see that it's like a mask, or it's got some kind of symmetry to the face, like some type of like a headgear or a mask is on. So these structures all over the surface of Mars really raised a lot of attention to the UFO community because we could clearly see that these are non-random artificial structures, especially the face on Mars. When NASA first filmed the face on Mars in the 70s, it was a live broadcast. And when this came over the transmission, they simply labeled it the head. And then a couple hours later, dismissed it as a trick of light and shadow. Well, that was a bad thing for NASA to do, because it turns out that there were several other images of the face that showed it under current lighting conditions. Now, you can see in this image, I've labeled water and land in the lower corner here. The face is surrounded by objects that appear to be pretty much right on a shoreline. If you look at this image and see where I've labeled land and water, all of the objects that look like pyramids are on that land portion where it's brighter, knobby terrain. And just right where you can make out a shoreline before it gets very smooth and mellow, do you see those objects are listed and built to be right on an ancient shoreline. And the face is built in such a way where it's pretty much positioned in the water to be looked at as a monument. So whoever built Cydonia built it as a monument for, waterfront structures, meaning everybody loves to live near a body of water, even on another planet. And so it seems that the face on Mars was built in such a way that all the structures encompassing Cydonia, from wherever you were able to look out and see the face as a monument. So that really raises a lot of questions as to, again, very clear evidence that this is an artificial structure, and that at some point in the past, human beings, just like us, maybe other civilizations, occupied this space. Now, we've been sending, as I said, for the last 2 decades, orbiters and landers to Mars. What's really interesting is the amount of data that we're collecting is just exponentially increased. From the DS1 comments in Odyssey, you can see we were in gigabytes. Now we're literally at terabytes, 34 terabytes. So the amount of data that we're collecting allows us to see things at a much higher resolution. So before, as an example, you could look at something with the Mars Global Surveyor and get down to about 150 centimeters per pixel. The Mars Reconnaissance and some of these newer cameras, now we're down to 30 centimeters per pixel, probably even better than that with the improvements of compression technology. So this is really what's going to allow us to, you would think, confirm some of the details of the face, the pyramids, and other structures. Let's get up there really close and under high res, look for some glyphs, ancient languages, something. But that's not the case, folks. Unfortunately, the people in charge of these tools have their own agenda. And it turns out that the technology is improving, but the quality is decreasing. You can see here that in 1976, the initial images of the face looked better than they do now. Over time, these images got worse until in 2002, it's almost not even recognizable as a face. This middle one, you can see in my screen here, was one of the worst ones. Art Bell, a radio host, he labeled it the cat box image. It's like a cat was just scratching on it or something, or it was bombarded with nuclear weapons or something. I mean, I don't know. The face literally looks different than it did 20 years ago. Like they're trying to make it even more inconceivable to be a face. But still, the evidence is there. Folks, with this image, the 1998 image, the worst one they released, watch this. When I take that face and I rotate it so that it's looking at you like any other face would, and then I split it in half, something interesting happens. Now, anytime you take your face and split it in half, like if you looked at yourself in a mirror and only looked at yourself halfway into the mirror, you're still going to see your full face because we're asymmetrical. So if you take one side of a face and mirror it, you still see the face. Some interesting data comes out when we do that to the face on Mars. When we take that image and mirror the left side and mirror the right side, I'm going to start with the right side. That right side clearly shows what looks like a face. There's eye sockets, nose, mouth, facial symmetry. The left side, though, however, when mirrored, goes well beyond any doubt that it looks like a face, right? Let me enhance that even further for you. That left side clearly shows a face. What we're looking at is some type of a headdress, almost Egyptian in descent, with a winged disc, a lion-like facial structure that literally resembles almost like a sphinx or a lion, eye sockets, nose, mouth, and some type of a headdress. There has to be some type of Mars-Earth connection. Now, when we analyze this face further to, try and bombard any of the skeptics with information to say, no, it's not just a trick of light and shadow. It's not just a face that if you move the angle, it goes away. That's not the case here, folks. Dr. Mark Carlotto, an imaging specialist, produced a whole bunch of tests to show that this was a non-random structure. It passes every single test to show that it's artificial. Any angle that you look at it from, it looks like a face. It also passed the test of a non-fractal analysis, meaning Dr. Mark Carlotto developed mathematical algorithms to detect artificial objects in satellite telemetry. When you run these algorithms, let's say over satellite photos of Russia and detect tanks and various other troops and things, his algorithm is able to show and get very accurate hits over 98% probability of artificial objects, right? So that same mathematical fractal analysis done to the face on Mars and pyramids, again, showed over 90% probability that the face and surrounding structures are artificial.